We will now be transitioning to the next portion of the webinar presented by the ALS Association. The views and opinions expressed in this webinar do not necessarily reflect the position of NEALS, the Sean M. Healy and AMG Center for ALS at Massachusetts General Hospital, or AMLIX. I will now turn things over to Dr. Neil Thakur and Dr. Kuldip Dave from the ALS Association. Dr. Thakur?
Thank you, Jinsy. So we're actually re-recording this. We had a glitch in the last recording, so we're just going to redo our show. But I'm Neil Thakur. I'm the Chief Mission Officer at the ALS Association. I coordinate the advocacy, care services, and research programs. And I'm here with my colleague, Kuldip Dave, the head of our research program. And we want to talk about the really exciting and I thought very well presented session that Sabrina gave, where she was talking about the findings from the New England Journal of Medicine study. So I'm going to go to the next slide here.
Thanks, Neil. As you heard from Sabrina's presentation earlier, this is how we see the scientific results published in the New England Journal of Medicine paper. This trial, the CENTO trial, was robust, and it had everything that you would like to see in a well-designed trial, a double-blind study, placebo-controlled, multi-center. This was a fairly large trial for ALS with 89 participants in the drug group and 48 in the placebo group, and was spread across 25 centers in the United States. From an efficacy standpoint, AMX0035 significantly delayed the disease progress as measured by ALS-FRS. And so, you saw in Sabrina's detailed presentation of the data, patients that were treated with AMX0035 scored an average of 2.32 points higher on ALS-FRS than the placebo group. Another way to do this type of analysis is to look at change from baseline. And when done it that way, when performed that way, the AMLIX group scored 2.92 points higher at the end of the 24-week follow-up. While we know ALS is a heterogeneous disease, every patient is different, every patient's symptoms are different. But in some patients, this 2 to 3 point change on an ALS-FRS score can be a difference in feeding on their own, or needing a feeding tube, or walking with assistance versus not walking at all. It's also important to remember this effect was on top of the standard of care. So I think 80% of patients roughly were on Riluzole or Radicava or both. So the effect that AMX0035 had was above and beyond that top of the standard of care. And the secondary endpoints that you can look at in a trial like this, such as breathing function, hospitalizations, muscle strength, while they were not significant, they were in line and in direction of the primary outcome, ALS-FRS. And I think what is important to consider in the benefit-risk equation here is the safety profile. AMX0035 demonstrated an extremely good safety profile, was generally well tolerated. Most of the adverse events were GI related. These were mostly described as mild and were short-lived and transient. Next slide.
So, what does this mean? It means that the efficacy or the clinical outcomes and the safety data from this trial are really promising. It's good evidence, strong evidence that it slows progress for ALS, that the safety record is really good, and from this trial, and it's building on safety data from previous studies, because this is a combination of two existing products. And so we were able to do our own review. We had access to some confidential data. We were able to talk with independent reviewers. We were able to talk with experts on our board, like Jinsy Andrews, and really think this through. And overriding all of those discussions is the fundamental reality of ALS that ALS is so devastating, that the existing treatments are so weak in their effects, that people with ALS are willing to undergo a higher risk for clinical benefit. And so what do we think based on this data? We're thinking that everyone should have this as a treatment option that they can discuss with their physician. We don't think this is saying everyone should be on this drug, but certainly we think everyone should have the ability to consider this as a treatment option. And so how do we get there? The standard approach is for the sponsor, in this case it's the company AMX, to conduct a longer and a larger trial, a phase 3 trial with many more patients to test the safety and test the efficacy. This is the way that the FDA is mandated, happens for everything. This is a phase 3 trial. It typically will take about 3 years from start to finish. And that's on top of the existing process where the sponsor has to prepare a new drug application that is hundreds of thousands or more pages to apply to the government. And then the FDA has to review all that material. And that takes probably 6 months too. So we're talking 3 years for the trial and then 12 months to apply and review. So let's think through how that process works. Let's say we do that phase 3 trial and it confirms what we're seeing in the phase 2. That means the community would have waited 3 years, 3 extra years to get this as a treatment option. Now, the alternative could happen. We could do this phase 3 trial and find out the results we're seeing in this study are wrong. And if you look, there's a test of statistical significance in the results, and they're showing a p-value of about 0.03. And that means there's a 3% chance, our best estimate is there's a 3% chance that these studies are just luck, that these findings are just luck. It's just a random happening. And if you did this 100 times, 3 times out of 100, you would get an error, a false positive here. That sounds like a very low benefit, but when you consider all the clinical trials that are happening now that the FDA has to review, if they're doing 100 trials, chances are if you get 100 good results, that 3 of them are actually fake results, false results. So it is possible that the phase 3 could disprove the positive things that we're seeing in this trial. And that would mean the people who, if we had just said, we're going to make the drug available, and then the phase 3 turns out to show that these drugs are not helpful, that the drug has very little benefit. But we also know that the safety data is very good, and the safety data is even stronger than the clinical benefit data. So if it shows that there's no benefit, it's also very likely that there'll be little harm. So we'll have people taking the drug, but not getting any benefit from there. So what we're thinking we should do is skip the phase 3. And that's because the disease is extremely harmful. There aren't a lot of great treatments out there, and the drug is super safe. And if we're wrong and it's a bad judgment to skip phase 3, then that means people would have taken a drug without a lot of benefit, but also without a lot of harm. Now, this is not a clear-cut case. As I said, there's a chance that these results are not real, and the positive things we're seeing are not real. And when the FDA has skipped phase 3 before, they tend to do it with a much higher level of certainty than what they're seeing than what we're seeing in this drug. This is the wrong standard of evidence to do for a drug, for a condition where there are lots of treatments or a condition that is not as deadly as ALS. This is not the right standard or the right approach for a drug for hay fever, for example. But for ALS, we think skipping phase 3 is appropriate because of the safety profile, because of the potential for benefit, and because ALS is so devastating. And so it's not just skip phase 3. What we're suggesting is a series of recommendations for both the FDA and the company AMX. And so we're asking we're asking the sponsor to submit their new drug application now, to ask the FDA to approve that drug quickly, but on top of approving it, to put on aggressive conditions for aggressive post-market studies so we can study the drug in real time as best we can to figure out if it actually has an effect. And while all this is happening, for the company to provide the drug, make it available under expanded access, and for the FDA to approve that expanded access petition. So again, company submits an NDA, new drug application, the FDA approves it, the company and the company and the FDA provide expanded access. So this is a petition to both the FDA and the company to do something that's very unusual, that would be a difficult position for the FDA and the company to make by themselves. And so you can see the URL there at www.als.org/petition. We already have about 37,000 people that have signed on to this petition. And it's really important that people do, especially people with ALS, because the whole logic of this model depends on this risk-benefit calculation for people with ALS to say, I'm comfortable taking a drug that is still early in the process, and because there's a chance of benefit, and I understand what the trade-offs are that we're asking the FDA to make, and that people with ALS are making with this decision. So that's the petition. I know this is a big decision. This is something the association hasn't done before. This would be a big step for the FDA to take, and people have some questions. And so we anticipated some of them. The first is, why aren't we doing this for other drugs? And the FDA has moved very quickly in some other cases. And when the level of evidence that we're seeing for this drug, AMX0035, is similar, when the FDA has made that push. In some cases better, in some cases not better, but it's similar. So we're in the ballpark of reasonable, but it's still a stretch for the FDA. The second part is, in the ALS space, AMX0035 is the first drug in a very long time, perhaps ever, but certainly in a very long time, to meet both primary and safety and primary efficacy endpoints in a peer-reviewed paper. So that means in the phase 2 trial, the drug worked as designed. The analyses everyone thought about ahead of time turned out to be significant and moving in the right direction. And that just doesn't happen very often in the ALS space. Another thing that everyone should know is, if the association, has a financial stake in this drug, we were able to support this trial in its early phases with funding from the Ice Bucket Challenge. And that contract, like almost all of philanthropic research grants, has a payback provision, which means that we could get a small financial stake if the drug ever goes to market. And that would be up to $3.3 million. And that money we would turn around back into research grants out into the community. You may also be asking if there are other petitions happening for this drug. We're not aware of any. What instead we're doing is we've been collaborating with other folks in the ALS community. ALS has partnered with us on this petition, and you can get to that petition from their website as well as ours. And it's been nice work. Show you what this looks like, just to remind you what this process is. We have a year-long process, no matter what we do, review and approval at the FDA and the company have to go through. And so what we have at stake here is the idea of skipping a phase 3 trial. And so we could turn what would be a 4-year process into a 3-year process and save the community 3 years. And this petition is a way to signal to the FDA that we think that that's the appropriate thing to do. So I'm going to stop there. I know Jinsey has collected some questions from people who have been watching. So please, Jinsy, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Thakur. We've got a question here. The first question is about why the support for AMX drug as opposed to other previous phase 2 studies. What makes this different?
Mm-hmm. I talked about that a little bit. Kuldip, do you want to talk about that more specifically?
Sure. There's the idea that Neil mentioned earlier around how novel this is in terms of a drug hitting its both primary safety and primary efficacy endpoint in phase 2. We've had examples of this phase 2 studies before, and one that I think everybody may have in mind, fresh in mind, is the neuron phase 2 study that was published in the neurology paper last year. And again, it's important to understand Brainstorm study did hit its primary endpoint, and in that case, it was the safety and tolerability, which was their primary endpoint. Their study was not powered for efficacy, and that was borne out in the publication when you looked at change in ALS-FRS with neuron versus placebo. There was no effect. However, post hoc analysis, there were several efficacy points that were positive, and this study, on the other hand, is a little bit different, as Neil said. There were pre-specified primary endpoint for ALS-FRS, and Centaur trial results showed that it hit that primary endpoint with p-value of 0.03. Not only that the drug was safe and well tolerated, and that was also part of the primary endpoint analysis.
Thanks so much. I have another question here, relates to the drug development models in ALS. Last year, the guidance was finalized for ALS drug development. Does this clinical trial provide an opportunity or a pivot point for clinical development of drugs in ALS? I think maybe Dr. Thakur, you could help us with that.
Sure. And Dr. Andrews, please call me Neil. One of the things that was really important about that clinical trial guidance is it started to get at this trade-off we're talking about between the devastating aspects of ALS and the risk tolerance of people that have with ALS. And so what we're suggesting here is you skip a clinical trial, and so the specifics of that clinical trial guidance don't necessarily apply, but the overall logic of carefully weighing safety and efficacy and what the community wants is really baked into that clinical trial guidance. And so this petition is a way to reinforce the concepts of that guidance about what the ALS community really wants. And so when the FDA takes that step, an aggressive step for them to say, we're going to move forward without a phase 3 trial, it would be really good for them to have something to point to say, this is what the community wants. We're reflecting their interests. They will probably take some heat from other people in the community who say that they're rushing. Because of the p-value is at 0.03, it's not less than 0.01. But that's the right case for this trial, for this drug, for this disease community. Every trial, every drug is different, and that's why we think a petition is an appropriate tool here.
Thanks, Neil. And so I have one more question here. It was noted in the presentation that ALS Association was a funder for the AMX0035 clinical trial. Could you describe the process in which grants or clinical trials or clinical research are funded by the ALS Association? I guess, Kuldip, you can take this one.
Thank you, Jinsy. Our review process for funding is deliberative and responsible process. And let me take a minute to explain what I mean by that. Almost all of our projects go through a three-stage process. The first stage is an LOI, or letter of intent stage. This is where a pharma company or an academic lab will submit a 1 to 2 page, essentially elevator pitch on what their research is and what they want funding for. We review this LOI and then ask investigators to submit a full proposal. So that's stage 2. And at this full proposal stage, we now have experts, key opinion leaders, subject matter experts brought in that would review the application, look at the target, look at the science, look at the feasibility, look at the team, look at whether the budget is the right budget and commensurate of the project. So there are many criteria that would be looked at this stage, and this committee would then score and recommend what they think should get funded by the ALS Association. And this is step 2. Those recommendations are then taken to our research committee of the board, and that is step 3. And the research committee of the board has the final and gets the final approval for funding. We lay out the recommendations that are put together by the review committee, but the research committee is the one that looks at these final recommendations and provides that final approval for funding. That's really the 3-stage process that our projects go through. We're proud that AMX0035 went through that process and was selected through that rigorous process and approved by our research committee for funding.
And most projects that apply for funding to us fail, and that's actually standard for all research funders. Most research applications don't get approved for funding. It's a very difficult process, and every scientist goes through it, whether it's us or ALS Finding a Cure, which also funded this project, or the federal government. That's just the way that system works.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question to that process. The question is, are there patients included in the peer review process for these grants?
We do have patients in patient voice and patient perspective integrated on our research committee. Patients make up our board of trustees, and patients also serve on many different governance committees across the association. For the research committee, that, as I explained earlier, approves and provides that final approval for funding. We have patients, we have caregivers, former and current caregivers. We also have basic scientists, scientists from industry, drug industry. We also have clinicians and even financial operational folks. And this diverse group makes up our research committee so that we can integrate all of those perspectives when projects are funded. It is important to note that this research committee, on which we have an important patient voice, is not just there to approve projects. This research committee helps me and the research team develop a strategic plan, guide our investments, operationally help us with how the research program works and executes on a day-to-day basis, and helps with our portfolio in general.
Thank you. I have a question here about how ALS Association interacts with Congress. What are some of the things that ALS Association are doing to interact with politicians and lawmakers to help efficiency in drug development in ALS?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a lot we do with Congress. We're working on a number of issues related to drug development and related to, and some of them are research funding. And so the association has been working for a long time to increase the funding of ALS research. And that's both through advocacy, and many of you have been directly participating in advocacy by going to our advocacy events, by going to the Hill, by calling or writing your Congress people to get increased funding for research. And it's also in how we've structured our research program. We offer small grants that research scientists are able to use to leverage into bigger grant applications from NIH with more data, so they're more successful. And so we've seen the level of funding from the NIH into ALS research increase tremendously through that combination of how we structure our research program and our advocacy program together. And so, for example, when we did an evaluation of the Ice Bucket Challenge spending, we found for every dollar we invested, there was $3 of follow-on funding in research. And that was through a combination of people building on our grants and NIH having more funding to spend in ALS in general. So the two work together. On top of that, we work to support the FDA budget, so they have the staff that they need so they can work faster. And we like to see them work even faster than that. We're supporting several other bits of legislation on new legislative authorities, or sorry, statutory and approval authorities for the FDA, different ways that they can fund research and fund expanded access. All of those things we're working on actively, and they're really important. But what's most important for this particular drug is for people to understand that the FDA has the authority they need to make this decision today. They can do what they need to do without changing the law or without going through Congress. And so we would like them to follow the petition requests that we have and move forward. And hopefully we can do that without congressional help, although we've certainly been keeping our friends in Congress apprised of what we're up to.
Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question or a clarifying question regarding the support for AMX0035 compared to other phase 2 studies.
Mm-hmm.
What makes this clinical trial data different, and why support this as opposed to others? I think, Kuldip, you want to clarify?
Yeah, and again, each trial should be evaluated on its own merit. And so I don't think we should get into, why this and why that. Every trial is different. And again, the question is in the context of Neuron. They made the right decision. Brainstorm made the right decision given the results of their phase 2 study to go into phase 3. As I said earlier, their trial was designed for safety as a primary endpoint and not efficacy as their primary endpoint. And in spite of that, they did see in their post hoc analysis that there was efficacy, which excited them to continue the path and keep testing in a phase 3 trial, which they're doing now. From a timeline perspective as well, their phase 2 data, which was peer-reviewed and published, happened 2 to 3 years after the start of their phase 3 trial. So they had already committed and I think made the right decision to continue development of Neuron in phase 3. For AMX35, that trial was designed to evaluate efficacy and safety as primary endpoints. There's sometimes a difference, and I think people get lost between what does primary analysis mean versus post hoc analysis. Primary analysis means that a priori, before the trial starts, you say that this is the endpoint that we are going to consider as our primary endpoint. Sometimes you hit that primary endpoint in the case of AMX35, and sometimes you don't. And sometimes when you don't hit that primary endpoint, there is something called a post hoc analysis where you look at the data, you try to stratify and select patients based on maybe a biomarker or clinical phenotype, and then you try to see if you're seeing trends in your data. And this is the post hoc analysis is very important because it tells you in what population your drug may work in. And so it is important to do. It's not trivial. It's not a backup. It is an important analysis to do, and that tells you how widespread your drug can work. And so again, as I said earlier, every drug is different and every trial is different, and you have to look at what was being evaluated, what was a priori selected as endpoints. It's not really fair to compare one against the other. We at the ALS Association want every drug to succeed and hit those milestones and endpoints and publish in peer-reviewed journals so that we can build support for it. Thanks, Jinsy.
Thank you. I have a question here of what can someone do now, today, to help get access to AMX0035?
As I understand it, there's nothing they can do to get access to the exact drug. One of the things that we're petitioning the company, AMX, to do is to make this drug available through expanded access, and they have to start their regulatory process again to get that moving. So that's why this petition is important, because the petition isn't just to the FDA to approve the drug, but it's to the company to pick a particular regulatory path, and also to make the drug available under expanded access.
Thank you. And a follow-up question to that, are there more than one petition, and are there other organizations involved in the petition? And also, who can sign the petition?
I'm not familiar of other petitions. We are working with IMALS, and it could be that other organizations choose to sign on to the petition as well, which would be great. Anyone can sign the petition, and when you do sign the petition, you can even check a box to indicate your connection to ALS, whether you're a caregiver or a clinician or scientist, or just an advocate for ALS. And I think what's most important is that people with ALS sign on to the petition, because they're the ones that are bearing the risk and potentially reaping the benefits of the treatment. And they're the ones that the FDA is thinking of mostly when they're doing these risk-benefit calculations. So one thing that people can do is not only sign the petition, you only need to sign it once, but you can share it with other people who you think might be interested. And one of the things we're trying to do here is do this without hype, without creating false expectation, without creating a false sense of hope. There is something really good happening here, but it's not the cure we're all hoping for. It's a decline in progress. And even then, it's not a slam dunk. And because it's not a slam dunk, the FDA doesn't have a simple decision to make. The FDA has a tough decision to make, and that's why this petition can help the FDA think about the risk and benefits in ways that really meet the perspective of people with ALS, rather than some perspective from another disease space, or the perspective of a regulator, or the perspective of a scientist. It's people with ALS, their needs have to come first in this decision, and that's what this petition's about.
Thanks so much. I've got a question here. Maybe we can fit in one more question about pricing, and it's a question of whether the ALS Association gets involved in pricing decisions for AMX0035. Maybe Neil, you can handle that one.
Sure. We don't have any ownership stake or ability to influence pricing, other than like any other outside group. So we don't have any knowledge about pricing. I don't know what they're thinking about. in terms of price.
So I think we've come to the end of the time for the presentation, and I thank you, Neil and Kuldip, for a very thorough presentation. We're definitely at a unique time for ALS right now, and I'd like to conclude with a final comment received, and so I'll just read it to conclude this webinar. The comment reads, "This is such a hopeful time for ALS. I have been working in the ALS field for over 20 years, and seeing the lack of any new treatments until edaravone came after more than 20 years, and seeing this now along with everything on the horizon is amazing. Thank you to all the researchers, the patients, their caregivers, and the funders to help find answers to ALS." With that, I'd like to conclude this webinar, and thank you once again for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.